suggest is that we start by taking just 1 minute of silence as a follow-up of the meditation this morning, the beautiful meditation, so that we just get present to the present. Okay? Just 1 minute. So first part, basics. I will come back to this. Money unveiled. So I said unveiled because there is an old idea coming back from the 19th century, which is to say that money is just a veil, What really happens in our life is barter, in a barter economy. That is, we exchange actually, courses in English against, 2 pounds of tomatoes, etc. And money is just a way to quantify the exchange, to make sure that the exchange is fair, and nothing more. So that's the old idea that money is a veil, and reality is beyond the veil. Okay. Now I'm going to try to unveil money, because money is far from being a veil. Actually, it matters a lot in our life, in our daily life, and that's a kind of secret that is kept by many people, many economists. You will understand why in a few minutes. That's what I'm going to try to do. So there is a first interpretation of where money comes from, which is the usual one that you would be listening to if you were to follow a standard conventional lecture in a standard conventional university about economics. So people would tell you, money comes from saving. So there is a wealthy guy, let's say in Switzerland, who worked hard during his entire life. He saved a lot of money, and he puts this money in a bank account, and the bank uses this money to lend it to someone else, like a poor student who needs money to fund his or her studies, or to buy a flat or whatever. So essentially, what comes first is saving. Then banks is just a financial intermediary, nothing more. Bank is a kind of broker between the wealthy guy who saves money and the poor student who wants to invest in his life, in a flat, etc. Okay? So this story is the classical story, and of course it's completely wrong. Because if this was true, you would ask the question, in the first place, where does saving come from? How come that this wealthy guy has money? Where does the money he saves come from? And how come that the quantity of money circulating in the economy is increasing? If it's just saving, it should be the same quantity of money for 2,000 years at least, which is circulating, year after year. And there are wealthy people who save that money and then who lend it to poor people. You understand that? So it cannot be true. It's a kind of mythological fiction. There is a second theory, which is a slightly more elaborated, which is called the fractional reserve theory of banking, which is a little bit more true, closer to truth, which tells you that, money comes from the central bank. So here you have the mother of all the central banks, namely the Bank of England in London. So this theory tells you what's happening is that you have a mountain. At the top of the mountain, you have the central bank, which is like God, Zeus in Greek mythology. And the central bank creates money and lends this money to private banks like UBS, Credit Suisse in Switzerland, Santander, Monte dei Paschi di Siena before it went bankrupt in Italy, etc., etc. So the central bank is lending money to these private banks, and these private banks lend this money to you. So essentially, the role of the wealthy guy who saves money has been replaced by the central bank. Okay? So this is not completely untrue, but what it claims is that the whole burden of money creation bears on the shoulders of the central bank. Okay? And no matter what, when the central bank creates money, the banks, the private banks, at the bottom of the mountain, mortal banks, they will lend it no matter what to people. So it assumes that there will always be a borrower for that money who is ready to borrow that money. But that's also not true. And we have witnessed this in the past 10 years in Europe, where banks were ready to lend a lot of money, but nobody wanted to borrow this money because you didn't have any opportunity to invest, because students didn't have enough confidence in the future, to borrow a lot of money, then they would be indebted for their entire life, etc., etc. So you didn't have any borrower. So what this theory believes is another completely fictitious law, quote unquote, in economics, which is called Say's law from Jean-Baptiste Say, a French economist, which claims that as soon as you have a supply of anything, there will be a demand in front of it. So that's one application of Say's law, which says that if the central bank creates money, lends this money to private banks, no matter what, these private banks will find a borrower to borrow that money. As a consequence, the unique place where we should think about money creation is the central bank. And that's not true, because it might be the case that the central bank creates tons of money, billions of money, of euros, Swiss francs, dollars, whatever, and there is nobody to borrow it. And this is exactly what we witnessed after the big crash of 2008. Okay? So this theory is wrong as well. It's not true. Okay? For those who are specialists, this theory also bears on the idea that there is a money multiplier. I don't go into the details, but that's also completely wrong. Never happens in real life. So in real life, what's happening is that money is endogenously created by private banks. And then only ex post, the central bank has to do complicated things to make sure all this makes sense. If you want me to go into the nitty-gritty of this, I can do it, but the most important thing, the most important takeaway for you, I guess, is that when you meet your beloved banker and you ask for a credit, a loan, because you want to buy a flat or to fund your studies, he is not looking, somewhere in his desk whether he has money. Even though he would say to you, dear lady, times are hard today and it's difficult to find money. I don't have money in my pocket, so it's hard for me to lend to you money. That's not true. What's happening is that he can create money ex nihilo in Latin, which means out of thin air, and this does not cost anything, just free. To create money is just to write a line on a code on his computer. And he does it every day. And that's the job of a bank. And that's precisely the reason why, if you want to do this, like Jean-Thomas, for instance, tomorrow morning, Jean-Thomas can open an office as a psychoanalyst. Nobody has any say on that. But he cannot open a bank. He cannot say tomorrow morning, I'm a banker. For that purpose, he needs the green light of the state. Why? Because in the Middle Age, the unique guy who could print money was the king. And the king would delegate to cities or banks the right to print money. So it's a delegation. You understand? Why? Because it's key. The question of who can create money is a key question, and it's a struggle of power. It's a power struggle. You get that? Does this make sense? So money is created by private banks. UBS, Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan. They create money every day. And that's normal. That's our job. What is not normal is that we don't know it. Why don't we know it? Because if we knew it, if the grand public knew it, then we could have a democratic debate about who is creating money for what purpose. Do we want to create money for financial markets? To play on financial markets, to have big bubbles, big real estate bubble, big financial bubbles, big crashes, and these kind of things? Or do we want to create money to fund meaningful projects like ecological projects in Europe or in the States or in Japan or elsewhere? We could also ask the question, do we want to create money to fund hospitals, public hospitals, to fund public school, or even to fund studies? No, why not? We don't have this debate because actually nobody knows where money comes from. That's the consequences. So the main topic is that the question of money creation has been withdrawn from the democratic debate. And I will show you an example of that. I will come to this, which is absolutely astonishing. So the central bank creates money also for free, okay? Like a private bank. The difference is that the central bank is at the top of the mountain, like in the second theory, you remember? And the central bank creates some money that you will never see unless you are a banker yourself. Because actually, in our world, there are two spheres of money. One which is the top of the mountain, where you have central bank money, and the other one which is the bottom of the mountain, where you have money, the money you know, the money I know. Okay? These two types of money never exchange to each other. in the sense that you don't have a market where you can find both monies. Either you are on the top of the mountain, where you have central bank money, or you are at the bottom of the mountain, where you have usual money. Okay? Now, there are relationships between those types of money. I can describe this, but that's just to understand. When the central bank prints money, this money never ends up in your pocket, never ever, unless you're a banker. Okay? Nevertheless, the central bank can create money for free, exactly like a private bank. The unique difference is that it's not the same type of money. Okay? Now here, what I'm going to show you, if it works, it's a press conference given by Mario Draghi, the former president of the ECB. So he was giving a press conference, and you will see there is a journalist who asked him a question about money creation. And you listen carefully to Draghi's answer, if it works, and then we will comment this. So that's not Mario Draghi. I guess that's an advertisement.
Wir müssen kurz umstellen.
Sorry, Entschuldigung.
Okay, gut.
Okay, thank you. Shh. Listen carefully to Draghi's answer.
I'm Kodak from Swedish television. I'm wondering, can the ECB ever run out of money?
Well, technically no. We cannot run out of money. So we have ample resources for coping with all our emergencies. So I think this is the only answer I can give you.
Maybe you can listen to it once again?
Yes, sure.
Just to help you understand what's going on. So the journalist asked, is it possible for the ECB, this European Central Bank, to run out of money? Which makes no sense, because the ECB is creating money. Wait.
Yeah, sorry.
It's as if you would ask, is it possible that the sea runs out of water? No? But according to the first or the second theory, banks don't create money. They take money from elsewhere. So they need to have resources, which is a myth, which is a legend. So listen carefully. So Draghi tries not to laugh at the question, because the question is stupid. All the others, they don't know how to react. Who is this journalist? But he doesn't want to reveal, we can create money out of thin air. He doesn't want this debate to happen. So he says, well, technically we cannot run out of money. So technically means I'm not going to explain to you why. Technically we cannot run out of money. And then he thinks about what kind of answer could I give without entering into the debate, no? Well, we have enough resources. Meaning, I have something in my right hand, under my right hand, from which I can borrow money to lend money to people, or to you, or to banks, or whatever. So he's duplicating the old legend that banks don't create money. You understand that? So let's listen to it once again.
Hello, I'm Kodak from Swedish television. I'm wondering, can the ECB ever run out of money?
Well, technically no. We cannot run out of money. So we have ample resources for coping with all our emergencies. So I think this is the only answer I can give you.
So yeah, I think this is very illuminating. So I'm not saying Mario Draghi is a liar, that's not the point. Nobody cares about Mario Draghi, that's his problem with God, no? But the truth is that, everything goes as if there would be a kind of big secret. We are all playing in the same Monopoly game. You have played Monopoly? So there's a bank in Monopoly. The problem is that we don't know that this bank exists in our Monopoly, in our true life, And we don't know for whom and how this bank is creating money. So the money flows under the table in your monopoly game and goes to some people. And these people don't want you to realize that and to be able to say, hey, why shouldn't I get some money? You see the point? And so this is happening in this kind of press conference, and it gets unnoticed. Nobody noticed that, except if you know that this is a big issue. So as you know, probably the ECB printed trillions of euros to save the banks since 2008. This raises a big question. Why wouldn't the ECB print trillions to save hospitals, to save schools, to save the planet? No? And I can remember I had a discussion at the Minister of Ecology in France back then, 2013, with Delphine Bateau, for those who know her, who was back then the Minister of Ecology in France. And I said, well, the ECB is saving banks, printing money. Why shouldn't the ECB print money to save the planet? And there was a banker who was there who said, well, the ECB would never do that. And fortunately, there was a woman, a female biologist, an activist, an ecological activist, and she took the microphone and she said to this guy, I understand that for you, banks are more important than the planet. But do you realize that if the planet gets destroyed, your bank will also go bankrupt? So we had this kind of discussion. So you get the main takeaway? So the next point is even more technical, so I cannot enter into the details. The main takeaway is that capital, the capital, does not exist. It's also a myth. What exists is money, which flows in the way I just described very quickly, and infrastructures, like here, buildings, roads, etc., etc. And you cannot confuse a building with money. These are completely different things. You don't create a building like this out of thin air. In order to create a building, you need matter, you need labor, etc., etc. It happens that by conflating everything under the broad, mysterious concept of capital, we are making big mistakes, big mistakes. My viewpoint, but I'm not alone to say that, is that we should disentangle these various concepts and say, well, there is money on the one hand, and this deserves the democratic debate about who is creating money for what purpose, and there are infrastructures. Which infrastructures are we going to create, for whom, etc., etc. And these are completely different things. Of course, they are related to each other, they are linked to each other, but they are not. You cannot confuse them and conflate them into a single concept. Is that okay? If you want more details, I can say this. What is crucial for me, and probably the essence of capitalism, and I'm saying this because probably there are ongoing debates about capitalism for 2 centuries at least since Marx. But even before Karl Marx, we had this debate. What is capitalism? I could have asked you the same question while I was looking for the slides, and I'm sure you would not end up with any satisfactory answer. So there are at least 10 different definitions of capitalism. The one I suggest is the following. Capitalism is a kind of way to organize a society where some people, some powerful people, put into practice the capitalization procedure. What is it? The capitalization procedure is a way to say, I decide that this chair is going to become a piece of capital. That's a stock that will provide me, if I'm its owner, private owner, that will provide me with incomes in the future from which I want to benefit. And that's the value of this chair. The value of this chair today is nothing but the discounted value of the flow of incomes that this chair is going to provide me in the future. That's capitalization procedure. Since when are we doing this? Since at least the 14th century, as far as historians know, and this was for the first time put into practice in a systematic way by Italian banks in the north of Italy. So the first capitalists, according to this meaning, are Italians. I don't know whether there are Italians in the room, but yeah, you could be proud of it, no? And I think when you go to the north of Italy, you feel this spirit, no? The capitalist spirit of northern Italians. Now, this technique has been developed in the 18th century in Germany by people who wanted to give a value to the forest. So the main question was how much wood could I extract from this forest in the next 50 years, they would discount this to the value today of wood, and they would say, that's the value of this forest. Okay? Back then in the 18th century, they didn't have any concern with ecology, so they just wanted to take profit, to take benefit of this forest. But you see where the devil is in this story. Once you begin to say, this forest is capital, you may destroy the forest if you have a better use of your money. You know? This forest can disappear tomorrow morning. If the disappearance of this forest allows you to make more money than the value you have computed for this forest, you are making profit. As soon as you give a price to this forest, the forest is dead, potentially. You know? And that's exactly what's happening now with the Amazon. We are destroying the Amazon, we are destroying the Congo forest because some people have decided that this is a piece of capital. Capital has this value, and as soon as they find something which has more value, they are okay with destroying this capital. You know, capitalism is destruction, creation, innovation. As Schumpeter would say, not a big deal. And that's the tragedy, because now we are destroying the planet, and the planet is definitely not a capital. The planet is not a stock of things that are going to provide us with incomes in the future that some of us will benefit from. If we destroy this planet, there is no planet B, as you know. You see the point? So I'm not saying that this procedure per se is a bad procedure. What I'm saying is that to extend this procedure to everything is a bad idea. It means you have to privatize everything and to say everything can be turned into a piece of capital. This chair, this building, even human beings, slaves are the first type of capital. You know, when someone is turned into a slave, it means that someone else, the master of the slave, believes that this guy or this woman is just a piece of capital, which will provide some income in the future, and the value of this slave on the market is the flow of the discounted flow of incomes that this slave is going to provide me with. Does this make sense? Yes? So you see the point? So capital does not exist, but capitalization exists. And the main, And the main point here is to say there is a big mistake here, which is first that there are things we don't want to turn into capital. And second, what matters in our life is not a stock, but our flows of things. Flows of money, flows of energy, flows of life, flows of love, but not a stock. And so by turning economics into the science of capitalization, which it is today, we are reducing everything to stocks and asking ourselves the question, what is the value of this stock? And then we completely neglect the flows, which matter. Flows of money, energy, even flows of matter, flows of love, etc., etc. Yeah, there was a question over there.
So therefore, the idea of ecosystem services and putting a label on them how much they're worth, like the bees are 2 million, is totally wrong.
My viewpoint is that this is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Very dangerous. Once you give a price to bees, you are ready to let the bees disappear. And you know if bees disappear, humankind disappears 2 or 3 years later because agriculture will collapse. That's as simple as this. And what's happening, actually, the truth is that in China, you have regions where bees have already disappeared. So who is doing the job of pollinizing?
Slaves.
Sorry?
Slaves.
Yeah, poor women in the countryside. You could call them slaves. So some of my colleagues would answer, no, it's not a problem. You know, we are going to build small drones which are going to pollinize artificially, blah, blah, blah. And this will increase GDP. That's fantastic, you know. But that's just bullshit. We know this is not going to happen for reasons I'm going to describe in a few minutes. The truth is that we will replace the bees by slaves. Yeah, a question here and then a question here.
Yeah, I would just want to point something out. It can be a way of like telling people who think only in monetary terms why it is important to save some forests. There are, it's a pity, but there are a lot of people who only think in monetary terms, and then it could be a way to tell them why it is so important.
Sure. But you know, the point is to understand that, I mean, when someone thinks in monetary terms, this someone is not a nasty guy that we should put in jail. He is the victim of a collective hallucination which is pervading our societies for centuries now, which is slowly the idea that everything could be turned into capital. You see what I mean? And if you have studied some finance, mathematical finance, you know that's the the bread and butter of every finance guy, capitalization. That's what he or she does every day, to compute the difference between the market value of a stock and the discounted value of the flow of incomes that this stock is supposed to provide with. And if there is a difference, that's called an arbitrage, and you should take care of this, you should take benefit of this arbitrage. And that's the basics of finance, you see? So finance, today's finance, without capitalization, disappears. There was a question here.
Yeah, it's more related to the slide before. So if the bank is only deciding about the creation of money, so I cannot influence with my investment decisions where the money goes?
Of course you can. So the question is, if banks create money, how come I cannot influence that by my investment decision? Of course you can. Because in order to invest, you are going to talk to your banker. And this is what happened in the past in Switzerland, for instance. I know that because I talked to a number of Swiss, old-style Swiss bankers before UBS and Credit Suisse became the monsters they are today. They would spend the entire day talking with people, talking with entrepreneurs. What is your budget plan? What is your business model? What do you want to do in 10 years? They would talk. And then if the banker is convinced, the banker would create that money that will fund the project to the entrepreneur. You see?
But me as a private person, if I invest money, so I can say I want to only invest in green ETFs, for example, does it really influences the decision of the bank?
You alone as an individual, you have a small influence, but if everybody says, no, we just want to invest into green projects, banks will be forced to fund green projects. Because if they don't lend money, they just die, the banks. That's the job, okay? So, and there are banks which are specialized in green projects. Genuinely, the best I know is Triodos, which is a bank from Netherlands, which tried during years to enter into the French market, but which did not succeed for a variety of reasons. Okay, they are good banks, quote unquote. So my speech is not an anti-bank speech. It's saying we need to have a collective discernment about what the banking system is doing and how to use it in a way which makes sense. You agree with that? Okay, so that's a good transition with your question. My feeling, I might be wrong, but my feeling is that the main stumbling block in the ecological transition that we need to put into practice, it's not the political class. Essentially, the politicians, some of them are very smart, some of them are very stupid, but on average, they are the mirror of our society, It's not the civil servants. More and more civil servants are aware of the gravity of the climate crisis, and the new generation of civil servants, your generation, is great. These are great people. It's not the private sector. I meet a lot of entrepreneurs who have completely understood today the gravity of the seriousness of the crisis and who definitely want to go green. The big problem, the stumbling block, are the banks. Why? And we published a report last year with the so-called Institut Rousseau, the Rousseau Institute, which is a French think tank, about the first 11 banks in the Eurozone. And we have scrutinized the balance sheets of these banks, which are not completely public, so they display some information, but not everything. So you have to make guesses, you have to work hard in order to get information. And the conclusion is that the first 11 banks of the Eurozone would all be bankrupt if we were to implement the energy transition tomorrow morning. That is, if we decided tomorrow morning that we no longer burn any fossil fuel, oil, gas, coal, they would all go bankrupt. Why? Because they have on the balance sheet financial assets directly linked to fossil fuel projects whose market value would be just zero if we decide to go green. You understand that? So more precisely, these fossil fuel assets or fossil assets represent on average 95% of the equity of these banks. 95%. So if a bank loses 95% of its equity, this bank is dead. As simple as that. The bankers, they are clever. They know that. They have made this computation way before me. Okay? So they have understood this for 10 years already. And they don't know what to do. Nobody wants to buy these assets today. Wait a minute. And so they are trapped with these assets, which play exactly the same role as the subprime credit assets in 2008. everybody had understood that these assets were worth nothing, were completely overpriced by the market, but the banks which had these assets were stuck with these assets because nobody wanted to buy them. It's the same here. So UBS, Credit Suisse, BNP Paribas in France, Société Générale, Santander, etc., they all have billions, literally billions of assets which are directly linked to fossil fuels. They don't know how to get rid of them. So it's as if, to take a metaphor, as if you were a smoker, so you smoke, and you have a lungs cancer. What I'm saying is that the metastases on your lungs are very big. They will kill you. Most of the debate today is dedicated to the issue of you stopping smoking. So many people say, and they're right, banks should stop funding brown projects linked to fossil fuels. And what I'm saying is that even if they do it now, which would be a very good thing, unfortunately, which is not happening, they still fund a lot of brown projects. But even if they were very courageous and they had a kind of epiphany, and they would fund only green projects, as Triodos is doing, then they would still die because they have these metastases. So we have to get rid of the metastases. Otherwise, the banks will always think, hey, if they really get green, my business model is going to collapse and I'm going to die. So that's why, if you know a little bit what's happening in the banking system, most banks since 2009 claim that they are ecologically oriented, that they fund green projects, blah, blah, blah. But this is essentially greenwashing. And in the background, in the backyard, they say to everybody, they tell to everybody, don't go green. It's too early. We don't need to go so fast, etc., with a number of technical arguments. Question over there.
Yeah. Thanks, Gaël. We had a conference before just your conference here with Mark from South Africa. South Africa is depending heavily on coal, right?
Yeah.
Coal energy.
Yeah.
And didn't he tell us that there's already a shift going on, that the banks no longer lend money, right, to the state or entrepreneurs in order to build new coal, what is it, plants, energy plants. Is there a shift going on? Or what would you say?
So what's happening in South Africa is probably the most interesting, successful story today that we have in the world.
Yeah.
So what South Africa is doing is something that was put into practice very regularly, on a regular basis, by the World Bank 20 years ago, which is called a debt swap for climate. What does it mean? It means so in South Africa it's Eskom, the state-owned electricity utility. So Eskom is essentially technically bankrupt. Eskom has millions of rands of debt, and Eskom knows that the coal mines will not pay back the debt because they become very inefficient, they are old, etc., etc. So on top of that, they have to invest a lot of money to save the coal mines. They don't have that money. Banks don't want to create that money for them because they know this is useless, etc., etc. So what they do, what the investors are doing in South Africa, they are telling Eskom, okay, we are going to forgive a fraction of your debt. As simple as this. We say you no longer have to pay back this debt. But in exchange for that, you are going to change your business model and to invest into green energy. That's called a debt swap. You swap your debt against investment into green. Is this crazy? It's not. The World Bank has done it in a number of places 20 years ago, but at the very small level, like micro projects, etc., etc. For the first time, to the best of my knowledge, a country is doing it. It's South Africa. And my viewpoint is that we could and we should actually duplicate this procedure in Europe. So, for instance, when I say for years now that we could cancel part of the public debt of European states, which is at the balance sheet of the ECB, in exchange for a green investment plan, a Green New Deal in Europe, that's exactly a debt swap for climate. So nothing fancy, nothing crazy, etc. But of course, if I say, we should cancel part of the public debt at the balance sheet of the ECB, the unique reason why this is possible is because the ECB is a central bank, and the ECB can create money like this. And if we enter into this debate about whether it makes sense to cancel this debt, some people will ask, do you have enough resources? Or might the ECB run out of money, if we cancel this debt? And then Mario Draghi or Christine Lagarde, for that purpose, will say, we have enough resources. because she doesn't want this debate to happen. So many of my colleagues, conventional colleagues, even 2 years ago, we had a fierce debate on Twitter about this. Some of them said, well, Giraud is crazy. He has completely, out of sense in ideas to cancel public debt at the balance sheet of the ECB. That's nonsense, etc., etc. So we went into the debate technically, and at the end of the day, they said, well, it's technically feasible, but it's a politically bad idea from a political viewpoint. And the question is why? Or because the credibility of the euro would be diminished. The euro, as a currency, would lose part of its credibility. Why? Because we would save Europe, which makes no sense. And I keep telling them, if we keep not doing anything in terms of ecology in Europe, then the euro is going really to lose its credibility because we are going to collapse, as simple as this. And now the euro is losing its value. You have seen that the euro is at par with the dollar, which never happened for 20 years. Now, I will probably have the same debate with my beloved colleagues in a few months, So what do you think about the credibility of the euro now that you are not doing anything? So maybe we should save the eurozone by cancelling part of this debt and implementing what South Africa is doing, what the World Bank did for years, which is a climate swap, a debt swap for climate, you see? We will see how they react. Yeah, please.
So, when this debt swap is happening,
Yeah.
who is losing? I mean, that would be the question.
Well, of course, the guy the lender is losing because he will not get back his money.
Right.
Sure. But the lender is clever enough to have understood that no matter what, in the South African case, Eskom will never pay back this debt because Eskom will go bankrupt.
So you have lost it already.
Yeah, so this money is already lost, so the investors have understood it, and now they think about the clever way to save the situation. So they forgive a fraction of the debt, maybe not all of the debt, and they still have the hope that the rest will be paid, in exchange for Eskom getting green. And we could do the same in the Eurozone. We don't need to cancel the entire debt at the balance sheet of the ECB. We could cancel a fraction of it, organize a big political summit, I don't know where, Brussels, in Strasbourg, wherever, where all the heads of state would gather, they would work hard during 3 days and nights, with Sherpas and all these ministers, and then they would give a big conference press, and they would say, we have found a way to launch a real Green New Deal in Europe. This will give hope, no? Meaningful hope. Yeah.
But here we are working under the understanding that we can invest ourselves into climate neutrality. And
That we can invest ourselves.
Get towards the climate neutrality through investment.
Oh yeah.
So my question would be whether we have the understanding about what is it, the green investment, and previously I was involved in the climate tagging, and if we have an agreement to, for example, support from public finances green jobs, green skills, then you really come to the question what it is.
Sure. So it's a good question, and very often there is this objection. Oh, you are talking about the green transition, but you don't know what it is. Nobody knows, etc. That's not true, honestly. There are plans for the green transition for Europe since years already. And not later than this year, the same think tank, the Rousseau Institute, published a roadmap for France. So it's just for France, but which describes, I believe, in a completely, really serious and credible way, the path from today to 2050, which leads to net carbon neutrality in 2050. It's not carbon neutrality, it's net carbon neutrality. So we need, for instance, forests to absorb the residual of greenhouse gas emissions. And now if these forests burn because of mega fires, then we are in trouble. I close this parenthesis, but there is a path. And the main scenario has been built on various other scenarios by some friends of us, so Jean Covici, for those who know him, RTE, which is a big utility in France, etc., etc. So, I think it's very serious and credible. But we don't have any debate on that. The French government doesn't even, maybe it reads the report, but doesn't want to discuss that. And now there is a green and ecologist, a Euro deputy, Philippe Lamberts, who asked us to do the same job at the European level. So I hope we will be able to deliver a report for, in 1 year and 1.5 years, doing the same exercise at the European level. Now, the question is, how much does it cost? Because usually the next objection is, okay, maybe you have an idea, maybe it's a good idea, but nobody wants to fund that. It's too costly. We don't have the money, I don't have the money, somewhere. So then you first have to debunk the idea that nobody creates money because money is taken from savings, which is not true. Then the question boils down to who can create money for that purpose? Okay, is it profitable? And then my viewpoint is, so first what we have done in this report is we have shown that essentially for France it would cost something like 2% of the French GDP each year. So a little bit more than 50 billion euros each year. So you might say, well, that's a lot of money, but at the same time, the French GDP is more than 2,300 billions of euros each year. So, 50 billions, that's not a big deal. If the purpose is to save the French economy, we have to understand what is at stake. And this would boil down to a little bit more than 30 billions for the state. Can the state afford to pay that? Sure, of course. It's not a big deal, honestly. We can discuss this, But essentially, my viewpoint is that we are perfectly capable of spending this money to save the French economy. And the big question for me is the 2%, we have called this 2% for 2 degrees, 2 degrees as a threshold, the carbon neutrality. Does it still hold at the European level? And this I don't know. I hope, but I don't know. Probably for Germany it's the same, but there are other countries for which it might be much more costly. For just an example, and I don't know, honestly I don't know the answer, it's Poland. Poland is heavily, there is someone from Poland in the room. Yeah, exactly. So Poland is heavily based on coal mines, like South Africa, and it might be much more costly for Poland to shift towards carbon neutrality. This I don't know. We have to study this. Okay. So, but my hope is that if it's 2-3% of the European GDP, we can pay that. It's not a big deal. We have paid much more to save the banks. So yeah.
So it's only about the political will to do this?
No, the problem is this. If a politician gets on power and a banker comes to him and say, hey, you know what, you're not going to do this because I don't want it to happen. And a banker today has more power than a head of state. You have to understand that the balance sheet of BNP Paribas is almost as big as the French GDP. So the CEO of BNP Paribas has almost the same kind of power as the head of state in France. When he speaks, everybody listens to him. You see? If you remember the scenario when there was the cancellation, the haircut of the Greek debt, you remember that, 2012, Greece was in a complete collapse back then. And there was a meeting with those people who really decide what we do with the Greek debt. They were 4 people, 4. So back then it must be Sarkozy, I guess, still Sarkozy, Angela Merkel. So the first 2 head of state in Europe, let's say, in the Eurozone, and then the CEO of BNP Paribas and the CEO of Deutsche Bank. So they were talking with heads of state because they have the same power. So if a bank doesn't want this to happen, it's not going to happen. You see what I mean? And why would banks refuse this to happen? Because they know they will be bankrupt. You understand? But they won't tell you this. They won't give a conference press and say, well, I don't want the Green New Deal to happen because I will be bankrupt. I will lose my business model. I will make less money. And I will lose my job. I don't want this. They will never say that, you see? And I think, and to be honest with you, I discussed this with bankers. And of course, out of the record, they said, yes, you're right. But they will never say it publicly. They cannot. So we have to find a way to save the banks despite this big secret, which is hidden, which is that banks create money, that we could do it, etc., etc. So we have to be more clever. You see, we have to practice judo with the situation. Yeah?
There is something I don't understand. So anyway, the bonds are going to go bankrupt because at some point we won't have any foreign energy.
Yeah.
So anyways, even if they don't want to invest now in green energies and so on, they are going to go bankrupt, so it's going to collapse at some point. So I don't understand why they're not progressively making a change in the conditions.
So you should ask them what they think. I don't know, I'm not in the head. But most probably they believe, this might happen in 15 years. Well, in 15 years I will be retired, I will have my villa in Davos or in Monaco and I will be fine, with my mistress and happy life. And the rest, you don't cook an omelette without breaking eggs, There will be some trouble. I look cynical, but I guess what they believe is that they just want to win time in order, hopefully, to find a miracle, to find a solution. But there is a solution to that. There will be a solution, before giving you the floor. What the European Commission is probably going to suggest one day is the same solution as the one we have implemented for fossil fuel, subprime assets. That is, we create a public bad bank in each country, one for Spain, one for Portugal, one for Italy, Germany, France, etc. This bad bank buys the assets, the brown assets, from the private banks. So it's like a surgeon which gets rid of, the metastasis. The banks are free. They get money instead of brown assets whose value will be zero. They have a lot of money, so they make money. So that's Christmas, for them. And the bad bank will tell you, there will be a big press conference saying, we are going to manage these assets. Don't worry. It will be fine. As they said for the subprime financial assets. I don't know whether you were probably too young to follow this, but they said exactly the same. The truth is what? The truth is that everybody has understood that these assets are of no value, so nobody will buy them, and the bad bank will make the loss. So the bad bank essentially will go bankrupt instead of private banks. So who will pay the losses of the bad bank? It's a state-owned bank. So the debt of the bad bank will be put at the balance sheet of the state. The taxpayer is going to pay at the end of the day. So this will increase public debt, and then your best Minister of Economics and Finance will say, we are spending too much money. I'm sorry. We cannot afford to have a public school or public hospitals. We have to close them. We are living above our means, But the truth is that we will have a very high public debt because we are paying the debt of the banks, which is exactly what happened in 2008. Okay? So I think that's a bad idea, because it boils down to socializing losses and privatizing profits. When banks make profits, they take it for themselves and for the shareholders, and when they make losses, we pay, once again. So I don't think that's a fair solution. There is another solution, which again uses the power of money creation by the ECB. We could say, well, we have a perfect candidate to be a bad bank in Europe. That's the ECB. The ECB could buy these assets and make the loss. And so what? The ECB is the ECB. You heard Mario Draghi. Can the ECB run out of money? Technically, it cannot. So it cannot. So the ECB cannot go bankrupt. You get that? So, but of course, when I say that, people immediately react. Some economists say, oh, you are crazy, you need to take holidays. We will never do that. Why? Not because it's a bad idea, I don't believe that. It's a much better idea than to ask taxpayers to pay once again. Because if we do this, and if we do it publicly, then we are going to have a true democratic debate about what the ECB could do. And this, some people don't want to happen. You get it? Yeah, question here.
Which scenario do you think is going to happen?
Well, the bad bank scenario.
But which bad bank?
Oh, no, the state. The state.
Really?
I hope not. So when I'm optimistic in the morning, I say, well, I'm going to win the battle. No, it's not me. But some clever people will say, hey, what about the ECB? The ECB could do the job. Because actually, to be honest with you, the ECB is already a bad bank. I don't enter into the technicalities, but the ECB already has very bad assets on its balance sheet, has purchased for a variety of reasons, not brown assets, but other assets whose value is very low. It has bought these assets to save the banks at a value which is completely overpriced, etc., etc. So the joke is that the ECB is already doing the job of a bad bank to save the banks. But nobody has understood that, and so there is no debate on that. Now, if we do, maybe they will use the power of the ECB without saying it. In the shadow, during the night, I don't know, just in order for this debate not to happen.
Is there
Okay.
literally no one within the ECB that thinks that what you just said is...
No, I'm not saying this. There are very clever and genuinely progressive people in the ECB. It's a complex system. It's not black and white, and there are very, very smart people in every institution, and also essentially youngsters, I believe, who really want to change things. So the best might happen. I'm sure this will never happen. And since this is already a little bit public, because, I was vocal on this, and I was not alone, the Rousseau Institute said it, etc., etc. So, I'm sure they read these kind of things, and they talk about it in the corridor, never in front of the camera, and they think, well, maybe we should do it. But don't ask Giraud to explain that, because he's such an asshole, you know? Yeah, please.
How do you think where the leadership should come from, or like where
The what?
Like the leadership, or like who would foster it? Where do you see?
Well, you know, if we had a German chancellor who would talk to the ECB and say, well, no, that's the end of the game. You know, now we have to be serious, because what's at stake is the survival of Europe. Then the ECB would listen carefully to Germany, I'm sure. A little bit less carefully to France, for sure, but to Germany, definitely. So if Scholz understood that and, you know, and asked the ECB to come to him, and Christine Lagarde from Frankfurt to Berlin, and would say, Christine Lagarde, no, I want you to do your job, to save Europe. Oh, she would do it.
So you see it only from like governmental?
No, because the question is, why would Scholz take such a risk? Maybe if the civil society is pushing, if everybody is on the street saying to Scholz, you're not going to be re-elected, which is probably not going to happen anyway, you're not going to be re-elected unless you do something with the ECB, then he would do it. That's the democratic game, you know? Not only the civil society, but also the private sector, big entrepreneurs. They have a say on that. And they could, once they have understood this, they could also go to Berlin and say, hey, we really need now the ECB to do something. Because otherwise we are in a big mess, you know? I suggest, it is a clarification question.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
on the ECB scenario, how
Yeah.
do we make sure that the losses will not be socialized again?
Or you can never ensure that. There will be, in 20 years.
There will be a bad bank as well. And then,
Sorry?
like if we do the parallel with the other scenario,
Yeah?
there will be the bad bank. How can we make sure that it's not
Oh,
again the
I see your point. No, I mean, these are more than 500 billion euros, okay? The ECB purchases that, maybe with a small reduction in the price, so that the banks feel the pain. This is conditional on the fact that the banks never, ever again fund brown projects, of course. So you make your surgical operation and you tell to the guy you are no longer going to smoke anyway, no, ever. And then the next point is that the ECB is going to lose money progressively over 20 years. You don't communicate on that, do it peacefully, nobody cares. You know. The equity of the ECB today is less than 80 millions. That's nothing. So the idea that the credibility of the euro and the prosperity of the eurozone would rest on the equity of the ECB is just a joke. So if the ECB loses this amount of money, equity will shrink to zero, will even become negative, but nobody cares. There was even a report published in Switzerland by the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, in Basel, which is, the BIS is the central bank of central banks. And the BIS published a report saying, you know, a central bank doesn't need to have equity to operate. Because it doesn't need to. Mario Draghi said it. Technically, we cannot run out of money. Why? Because the central bank creates money out of thin air. Make sense? I suggest to stop here. We have a break of... Sorry. Is it urgent? Burning?
It's a quick question.
Okay, go ahead.
So just assuming that the debt swap doesn't lead to things like bankruptcy for the banks, was it a democratic process that leads to something like that, or what causes?
In South Africa?
Yeah, what would incentivize something like that to happen in Europe?
Well, you should ask this question to Mark Swilling first to have the details. It happens that Mark, he is the chair of the board of the DBSA, the Development Bank of South Africa, which is the South African analog of KfW in Germany, or AfD in France, you know. And as such, he knows the political class and he can talk to it. And it happens that the current president knows him because they were all activists during the apartheid against apartheid. So they have struggled together.
So this activism?
Yeah. So it's essentially the past, the apartheid, which has glued a number of people together, a whole generation, and this generation listens to each other. So they talk to each other. And they are free because, you know, they have ended tragic situations. So, you know, when bankers say that's not possible, they say, are you sure? You know? So they're not impressed by the technicality of bankers. which is not the case in Europe. I know a number of Eurodeputies who have made very bad decisions, I don't want to give names, and when I asked them, why did you vote this stupid law? And they told me, well, you know, a banker from the city in London came to me and his suit had more value than my salary for my entire year. So I was impressed, I thought, well, this guy must be clever to make so much money. And he told me, you have to sign this law, and I did it. I'm not exaggerating. So we make a break. How long?
15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Until 10:30.
Okay, and then the third point is energy, minerals, and biomass. You remember that I told you the capital does not exist. What exists is money and buildings and railway stations and power plants, etc., etc. So now we are going to enter into this. And let me begin with energy. As you know, climate change is basically due to the fact that we burn fossil fuels and we are addicted to fossil fuels for 2 centuries now. Now, there is a beautiful work on which we are working in Georgetown University, which has been published a couple of years ago by the team of a guy called Mora, who says the following. We know that, and that's a clinical observation, there are combinations of average daily temperature and humidity which are lethal for a normal human body. Also not for Valerio, because Valerio is way above the average of human beings, But for a normal human being like myself, it's deadly. So for instance, if you have 40 degrees Celsius, as soon as you have more than, let's say, 25% of humidity, then if you're exposed to this more than 6 hours, and you cannot rely on air conditioning, you're going to die. Why? Because your body can no longer cool itself, because you cannot sweat because of the humidity outside. Okay? And I'm sure you have made the experience, if you went to Vietnam, like I did a couple of years ago, that it's much more difficult to do your jogging in the Vietnamese jungle than here in Switzerland, or even in Chad, in the savannah, which is much hotter, but much drier. Okay? Our body can adapt to a very hot and dry climate, but less hot, but much more humid, we cannot. Okay? It's deadly. So here you have the curve of deadly combinations of heat and humidity. Okay? So the main point is that, so this is not Mora, this is our simulations. We have challenged his own simulations, so this is what we have done. And this is at the end of this century, the situation if we don't do anything. So that's the outcome of the business as usual scenario. I hope this will never take place, so don't get completely desperate, okay, or depressed by this map. But that's the default scenario. And we have to understand that if we don't do anything, that's what's going to happen. Okay? So what is this? The color is very simple. It's the number of days per year where people will be exposed to lethal combinations of heat and humidity. So if it's dark, red, brown, or even black, it means virtually every day. Which means nobody will survive there. People will have to move. Either they will have to die, or they will have to migrate. Okay? If it's light orange like this, it's approximately 1 day of a tube, and if it's white, you're fine. Okay? So as you see, the Amazon basin will be deadly and therefore empty. Central America will be in a bad situation. The Congo basin here, it's not the Congo basin, sorry, it's the Western Africa here will be in a complicated situation. Okay? And it happens that we are much more optimistic than Mora, by the way, for those who know Mora's paper. Insofar, we don't see that the Congo basin becomes uninhabitable, while he finds this in his projections. But we all agree on the fact that the Arabic Peninsula will become uninhabitable, India will become uninhabitable, and Southeast Asia as well. So, for instance, there is one country which worries me the most, which is Indonesia, here. Indonesia will be exposed to everything. Peaks of heat and humidity, rise of the sea level. You know that they have already moved the capital city. So Jakarta is no longer the capital city because Jakarta is drowning under the seawater. Okay, they are exposed to typhoons. They will have lack of fresh water. It's a poor population. It's the most populous Muslim nation in the world. So you can imagine the political mess that this will be. Because the question is, where are they going to migrate? They might try to go to Australia. Well, the north of Australia will not be more hospitable. And the south of Australia, I don't know. Australia today is not a very hospitable country for political reasons. They might go north, but north, this is essentially the courtyard of China. Whether China will accept that, it's a completely open question. So you see, this map opens gigantic doors about what might happen if we don't do anything. There are also very, very interesting places like the US here, it's yellow, as you see. China here, it's yellow, even a little bit orange in front of Taiwan. That is the three pairs, the big delta. What's the name of this? It's a big river with 3 cities: Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and I think it's Macau. There. So this is going to become uninhabitable, also in China. So there will be big migrations inside China, inside the US. Okay, so we should think about it in advance. Otherwise, it will be a mess. You understand that? So I'm showing this to show you that the first threat in economics is this. It's not flexibility of labor market or openness of your frontiers to foreign investments. It's this. And when you talk to heads of states in the South, as I did as the chief economist of the French Development Bank, the first concern is this. I remember a conversation I had with the government of Tunisia. This was in 2017. So when I came in 2017 in Tunis, they told me, well, the main concern for us is inequality. Inequality between the poor female peasants inside Tunisia, let's say in Kairouan, for those who know, the beautiful mosque of Kairouan, vis-à-vis versus the powerful Tunisian businessman who studied in Oxford, who has access to 4 or 5G, and who is living in Sfax, for instance, on the coast. Okay? So they told us, help us understand how to reduce these inequalities. So we began the work, and when I came back 1 year later, they said, forget this. It's very important, but there is much more urgent today. We don't have water, fresh water, which is becoming a national emergency in Tunisia. And in order to have an access to fresh water, what Tunisians want to do today is to build big plants that will desalinate the seawater from the Mediterranean Sea to provide the Tunisian agriculture with fresh water. But for that purpose, you need a lot of energy. And of course, you need this energy to be clean. Because if you're doing this with fossil fuel energies, that's too bad, But they don't have enough energy production inside the country. Unlike Morocco, which has access to a big solar power plant in Ouarzazate. So now they need to build solar power plants in order to have energy, in order to desalinate the water, in order to have access to fresh water. You see? So you start seeing the nexus between energy, water, minerals actually, and biomass. So I'm entering into this. But it's just a way to tell you that southern countries are completely aware of that. Those who haven't understood that, it's in the north, essentially Europe and the US. Okay? What's happening? Oh, yes. So, sorry. Oops. Yeah, now it's working. Oh, yes. So I don't have time to enter into this. I will skip that. So this is what I mentioned earlier. 2% for 2 degrees, the report that we wrote for France. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a question from the previous slide. I saw that the Central African countries are in a safe side.
Sorry?
So the Central African countries are in safe side. What's the reason? Is it because of...
It's not humid enough. It's too dry. You have the Sahara here. So Chad is a little bit concerned on the western side, but Sudan is not concerned. It's too dry. I mean, the north of Sudan, yes, but the south of Sudan is too dry.
Okay, but the white areas, which are...
Here, it's not humid enough. So, for instance, South Africa is not concerned by this, even though South Africa is heavily concerned by the lack of fresh water. But that's another topic. Okay? Yes. And sorry, and Europe is not concerned either, you see?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, wait a minute. Here?
Is it just uninhabitable because of the heat and humidity thing, but not of... Is there enough resources to feed the population?
That's a completely different story. I'm going to this. Yeah.
I was just wondering, what year this is from?
This is the end of this century.
Okay.
So we have time. to prevent this from happening.
Or, I'm sorry, the year that this map was created, you know?
The map,
Yeah.
this year. Okay, other question? Okay, so, the next point is that there is also at the same time a crisis in minerals. Now we are starting to experience it because, and everybody believes that this is due to the COVID era, to the COVID pandemic, which has broken a number of value chains at the international level. So we lack a number of minerals for our, we lack semiconductors from Taiwan because Taiwan had a bit drought, and in order to build semiconductors, you need a lot of water. But actually, it's a general problem that a number of key minerals are getting scarcer and scarcer. So the most critical mineral, to the best of my knowledge, is copper. So I have a paper with a friend of mine where we have shown that we might reach the peak of extraction of copper by 2060 at the world level. Doesn't mean that there won't be copper anymore after 2060, but it means that the density of the reserves of copper will be so low that it will require so much energy and water to extract this copper that we will no longer probably be able to increase the flow of copper that we extract from the soil every year. We will still be able to have copper, but no longer more in, let's say, 2065 than in 2064. This will be the peak of extraction. And if you understand that, let's say, GDP growth relies also on the increase of the material footprint of the economy, and among other things, on the increase of the quantity of copper that we use, you see that there is a problem. You get that? So a big challenge, for instance, today for our industries, be it in Switzerland, in Germany, in the US, in Japan, everywhere, is to find substitutes to copper. I'm not aware of any big plan to find substitutes to copper. But this is exactly what we should do today if we were clever enough to understand that. And my experience is that when I talk to entrepreneurs, they have understood now the climate challenge, which was not the case 10 years ago, but today it's clear. Now they have understood it. So the energy problem, they have understood it. Now the next point is minerals. They still open their eyes like crazy when I talk about this. Okay? And of course, on top of that, there is a geopolitical issue due to the fact that minerals are not spread equally on Earth. So we are going to have wars dedicated to mineral extraction. And it might perfectly be the case that what's happening in Ukraine has something to do with this. Ukraine is the big producer of a number of key minerals, not just agriculture, but also minerals. And most probably, that's my hypothesis, Russia and China were happy that Russia would do the dirty job, invading Ukraine within a few days, that this was the dream, and then China and Russia would plummet the country. The agriculture of Ukraine can feed 600 million people, just the agriculture of Ukraine. So with just this, you feed half of the population in China. That's interesting. On top of that, you have access to a number of key minerals for which Ukraine is the first producer or one of the first producers in the world. So it's very interesting to have Ukraine in your basket, you see. So fortunately, the plan did not happen, but maybe this war in Ukraine is just but the first war for natural resources, and there will be many others. If we don't do anything in order to set us free from our dependency towards natural resources like minerals. One very beautiful example that I like, which is that today we know how to build photovoltaic panels without minerals, or almost no mineral. Purely organic photovoltaic panels. If we can develop this at an industrial level, it means we have an access to solar energy without being dependent upon Chinese minerals. That's a very good news. So I'm not saying that the situation is desperate. I'm just saying we need to be more clever than that. We need to go faster and to find solutions. But if we are not even aware of the problem, we are not going to look for solutions for a problem which does not exist in our head. You get the point? The next issue is biomass, and that's food. So there was a question on food security here. You know that a big food security crisis is looming now at the world level, both because of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, because they don't export the wheat they used to export, especially in Africa, but also because value chains have been broken by the COVID pandemics, okay? And also because global warming is also slowly now decreasing the productivity of fertility of a number of soils. Okay? And we know that when we will reach plus 3 degrees, which we might reach in the second half of this century, unfortunately, then the fertility of most soils will decline tremendously. And then we will have a huge problem, which is how to solve the food security equation. Okay? So this is a map that has been built by researchers from NASA who are now working with us, Mark Imhoff. And this is just a production of biomass on Earth. So where does Earth, the planet, produce biomass thanks to solar energy? So you recognize, of course, the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, and the rainforest in Southeast Asia. Okay? Now, this is places where human beings consume or destroy biomass. Okay? So it's a completely different map, of course. And here you see that the north of the US and Canada are big consumers, of course, Europe, of course, the north of India, here, and of course, China. And again, Indonesia, here. So there is a gap between places where biomass is produced and places where biomass is consumed. And so this map shows you the gap. So this is the deficit of biomass consumption. Insofar, if I consume more biomass than the biomass which is produced in my neighborhood, I'm in deficit, which means that I have to import that biomass. Okay? So the color is easy. If it's if it's black, it means you are consuming 1,000 times more biomass than you're producing in your neighborhood. Okay? So, and if it's orange, red, it's 200, 300, 400 times more. So you see there are places which are in trouble, a little bit in the US, a little bit in Europe, but essentially the Arabic Peninsula, which is not a surprise, and also essentially India, here. And to be honest with you, I'm very surprised that the Modi government doesn't do anything, apparently, to solve this. We know this now for years. How come that India does not have a big plan to save the north of India? The north of India will have huge famines. You understand that? China is also in trouble. Okay? Japan. And again, here, Indonesia. You see? So this tells you that the food security crisis, which is now looming, will pervade for decades if we don't do anything against that. So fortunately, the United Nations will probably have an initiative in order to fight against the food security problem in the fall. I hope that my program in Georgetown will be part of this initiative to provide, simulations, prospective scenarios, etc., etc. But it's just happening now, so it's already a little bit late. Let's hope it's big, and let's hope it's bold. Okay? And I do believe what economists should worry about is this, not the flexibility of the labor market and these kind of things. This is much more important. Don't you think so? Okay, so I will skip this, and the next point is economics of living. So essentially, conventional economists believe that the economic world is based on two things, which is labor and capital. As I told you, capital does not exist. It's a kind of fantasy. And labor, it's your labor, my labor. Okay, this exists for sure. But we should replace it with biomass, minerals, energy, etc. And also living bodies. We are living bodies. And we rely on living ecosystems. So how do you let life enter into the picture of what economists have in their mind? That's the main question. So the main idea goes back to the work done the beautiful work done by Georges Rogan in the 70s. And the following idea is to say, actually, an economic system is but a dissipative structure, what we call a dissipative structure, like a metabolism. So Jean Thomas' body is a metabolism. What does it mean? He relies on the flow of energy when he breathes, when he eats, when he drinks. A flow of matter when he drinks, when he eats. His body metabolizes this. He digests what he eats, produces work. He follows conferences by Gaël Giraud, for instance. That's a work, because you have to listen to. So he consumes energy in his body. He works himself, and he complexifies his body, his brain. So he has new ideas. So he complexifies his brain. Maybe he's no longer growing now because he's very tall. But as a kid, he would grow. He would use the energy that he consumed in order to grow, and he has some wastes. That's metabolism. The idea is that an economy is exactly the same. At the collective level, an economy is but a big body which consumes energy and matter, which metabolizes it, and which exudes a number of wastes, which are nothing but degraded energy and degraded materials. Okay? And then if you think of an economy this way, you can embed this economy into a much broader system, which is the planet, with all its ecosystems. And at the end of the day, you end up with the idea that, there is a big source of energy, which is solar energy. This solar energy feeds the planet as a big dissipated structure, allows the planet to produce biomass, which is what we saw earlier, here, okay? We use this biomass in order to eat it for our purposes, for cows, for cattle, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, we are metabolizing this energy, and we produce work, like giving conferences, and we exert waste. Okay? So then this raises immediately the question of how can we recycle that? Can there be a virtuous cycle, in order to help us minimize our material footprints, etc., etc. But this picture is completely, it's somehow far away from the traditional picture that is taught in business schools, for instance. Okay? We are working on this at the Georgetown University, and I think this is very promising because it's a way to understand. Well, if there is a constraint here in matters, what's going to happen in the economy? If I can no longer eat, I'm going to die. So it's the same for an economy, for a city, for instance. If the city can no longer rely on its, called in German, hinterland, from which it borrows everything it needs to survive, then the city is in trouble. You see? But you cannot see it if you believe that the world is made of capital and labor. Because these are two entities which have nothing to do with the metabolism, with matter, with energy, water, etc. You get it? And of course, if you want to go further, then the situation becomes even more complicated because life is not just a thermodynamical concept. It's more profound than this. There is an ongoing scientific debate, at least since the 30s, about what is life. And there are a number of great minds who have thought about it. There is no consensus on that. But what is clear is that living ecosystems are dissipative structures, so metabolisms, what I just described. But on top of that, they are connected into highly complex networks. You can think of a tree, if you know a little bit how a tree works. So actually a tree alone does not exist. A tree is connected to a number of other trees beneath the surface, okay? And communicates with the other trees in a very complex way, okay? There is a whole, how do you call this? Earth web system, Yeah, exactly, Wood Wide Web, exactly. So there is the WW web for us, and there is the Wood Wide Web beneath the surface where trees communicate with each other. So for instance, you say, wow, Camille is resting under this tree over there. How nice a guy he is, So they communicate to the other, these kind of things. And so there is a network. This network is hierarchically self-organized. It's not a one-level network, so we have to think and to understand how these networks organize themselves into hierarchies. Okay, they develop themselves. So this is what I said when I said that Jean Thomas is complexifying his brain and his body. So these networks, since they're living bodies, they complexify themselves spontaneously, thanks to the energy and matter that they borrow from the environment. And they have complex responses, which means that the response is not a linear reaction to what's happening. It's much more complex than that. And on top of that, and this is very interesting, when you speak with biologists, they all say that there is a lot of redundancy in nature. Why? That's a backup. If there is some aspect of the reaction that doesn't work for whatever reason, they have a backup because it's redundant. Okay? So it's exactly the opposite of the idea that we should maximize profit under some budget constraint, which tells you that redundancy is a very bad idea because you are losing money. No? So this is what we did in France, for instance. We burned masks a few months before the beginning of the pandemic in France. Why? Because this was a stock, a bad capital, which would not provide income in the future. So you see the reasoning. You say, well, this stock of masks is a capital which does not provide anything. Therefore, its value is 0. So that's the capitalization procedure that I mentioned earlier. Okay, and then you burn it because it's useless. If you want to maximize your profit under your constraint, you should be efficient. Efficiency means no redundancy. So nature behaves exactly in the opposite way. Nature creates a lot of redundancies because that's a way to be resilient. Okay? Maybe we should have learned this during the pandemic, no? So I don't have time to enter into all the details. Do you have questions on this? I'm going very fast, but...
What is the last sentence in
Here?
Ciencia?
Ah, okay, Ciencia non est singularium. Okay, so yeah, sorry, it's good that you ask the questions. So this is a quote by Thomas from Tommaso d'Aquino, no, in Italian, the big theologian from the 13th century, the Dominican, Thomas Aquinas. So there is a big debate in the 13th century, in the Middle Age in Europe, about whether science is the science of general statements, as we would believe at least since Aristotle, or whether science can also deal with singular entities. For instance, to give just a simple example, you might have a science of the flower as an essence, but now what does it tell you about this flower here, which is unique? Which is unique fragrance, unique color, unique size, unique place in history, which will disappear in a couple of weeks. You see that? So there is a gap between what science, in the sense we would understand it, says, general statements, and the nitty-gritty of the singularity of this entity. So, which is, I believe, a very modern discussion. So in the 13th century, you had this debate, which essentially boils down to Thomas Aquinas on the one hand, and Bonaventure on the other hand, the Franciscan guys, so the Dominicans against the Franciscans. And then 1 century later, you had one very famous guy, Wilhelm von Ockham, okay, who said, well, there is no such thing as an abstract essence of the flower. This does not exist. What exists in real life is only a variety of singular flowers, one after the other. But this changes completely your understanding of science, of course. You get a point? And so my experience is that when you talk to biologists today, except for biologists who work in genetics, but all the other types of biologists I know, they would tell you at the end of the day what matters is the singularity of this flower, of this tree, of this ecosystem. And I don't care about a general statement, like quantum mechanics, which would tell you there is an uncertainty principle. I don't care about that. What I care about is the singularity of this tree. You get this? So biology today is mostly organized intellectually from an epistemological viewpoint around the idea that science should be a science of the singularity. So scientia in Latin, singularium, of the singularity, of the singular things. And this is at odds with what a number of people believe, including Thomas Aquinas, that science is only about general statements. Okay? So, of course, economics, conventional economics, is based completely on an Aristotelian understanding of science and believes that they have to have big laws, So, Say's law that I mentioned at the beginning, every supply creates its own demand, which is, of course, completely wrong, which doesn't exist in real life. But these are laws. So, economists love laws. Even Piketty, in his book, he created 2 laws of capitalism, which are wrong, both of them. But he said, well, I found 2 laws. This is, like the first 2 laws of thermodynamics. So you look serious when you have big laws, even though they are completely wrong. So economists love to do that because they give themselves the impression that they are as serious as physicists. But if they were to talk with biologists, they would understand the world is completely different. Of course, there are big laws, which some of them have been identified by physicists, but then there are singular objects which are studied by biologists for centuries, and which matter at least as much as general laws. Does this make sense? Sorry, a long answer to this question.
I didn't know this debate existed.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. So institutions, the last part of my talk, and we have another break, no? In how long?
You can say they haven't checked.
Sorry.
15 minutes. Maybe.
15 minutes, okay. So I begin this last part. So this is a quote by Francis in his beautiful encyclical 2015, Laudato Si, number 123. You should have this. You know, there are a number of phone numbers you need to have in your mind. So 123, that's the paragraph of the encyclical you have to read, which is on the board now. Another one is Jeremiah 31:31, for instance, in the Bible. You know, John 15:15, etc., etc. There are a number of phone numbers. So here, the Pope writes something very astonishing. So I'm going to read it with you. He says, the culture of relativism is the same disorder which drives one person to take advantage of another, to treat others as mere objects, imposing forced labor on them or enslaving them to pay their debts, for instance. The same kind of thinking leads to the sexual exploitation of children and abandonment of the elderly who no longer serve our interests. It is also the mindset of those who say, let us allow the invisible forces of the market regulate the economy and consider the impact on society and nature as collateral damage. So what the Pope is saying is something very strong, very harsh actually. He's much more radical than I am, you know. He's saying those crazy economists who claim that if bees disappear, it's not a problem, it's a collateral damage, you know. If the planet is destroyed, it's not a big deal, it's collateral damage. They have the same kind of mindset as sexual abusers. That's what he writes. Or they have the same kind of mindset as those people who, you know, in places for elderly, abuse elderly people. And unfortunately, as you know, this is happening. You know? And he says it's the same kind of mindset as those who are enslaving others and treating them as slaves.
An animal.
An animal. So he doesn't mention animal here.
Why doesn't he mention?
It's a question you have to ask him. So what I can add to this is that you're right. I had an audience with him in September 2020, and we discussed about this. And he added a fourth item, which was relationship between males and females. So how men are abusing women in their daily life. So he said another similar mindset is those people who are just mistreating women because they belong to this old-fashioned patriarchal mindset. You see? So he's making an analogy which goes very far, I believe. So it happens that there is a French philosopher, very famous to the French, Jacques Derrida, who coined the concept Carno-phallogocentrism. So very briefly, what does it mean? Carno is for meat. So you know, the white male who eats meat. And my experience is that, so I'm a vegetarian, but my experience is that when you talk to people and you say, you know, for ecological reasons, we should all become vegetarians, you know, some of them react in a very violent way. You want to prevent me from eating meat every day? Are you serious? You know? And sometimes, if they are males, they think in their head, probably my virility, you know, my sexuality will be impacted by this. I will no longer be the alpha male I'm supposed to be if I don't eat meat every day. So they have this kind of reasoning in their head. You know, maybe completely explicit, not completely explicit, but this is happening. Sometimes I also find women who react in a very violent way. I remember once in Paris, I gave a conference at the Centre Sèvres, you know, and I said, well, we should all become vegetarian, all of us. It's the best way to reduce our material footprint and also to reduce methane emissions because of cows, etc., etc. And then I was invited for dinner by a couple, and the woman, we were in a restaurant, and the woman said, and now, Father, I'm going to eat a good steak. She wanted to show me that really I hadn't succeeded in converting her, you know. So these are not just males, but also females react this way. So the idea of Derrida is to say, well, Carno, that's meat. Phallo, it's phallus, you know. So that's the patriarchal attitude, alpha male attitude towards women. And logo, it's the idea, the Europeocentric idea that the European Vernunft in Germany, the European reason, is universal. So that's the colonial idea that non-Europeans don't know what universality is, what the concept is, because they don't have Greek origins, they don't have Greek roots. But we are fortunate enough to have Greek roots, so we speak Greek, so we know what a concept means, we know what being means, universal laws, reasoning, law, thanks to the Romans, etc., etc. So this old idea, which is still vivid today, I believe, ask our friends from Africa what they think about it. which is a very racist idea. So Derrida was saying it's the same logic which goes from people who don't want to give up meat, those people who mistreat the women, the wives, and those people who really believe that Europeans are the summit of human beings because they have access to reasoning. You see what I mean? So this concept by Derrida is quite close, I believe, to what the Pope is saying. So Derrida comes from a completely different background, actually a Jewish background from North Africa. Francis comes from Argentina, Catholic, and they both, I think, go in the same direction, saying there is something common to all these misbehaviors, which is a wrong relationship to the world. Yeah, please.
I was wondering if you could clarify how you would explain the use of the word relativism. Just from a social science background, we use it a lot when talking about like coloniality and paradigms of knowledge, which essentially is between, the colonization of academia, essentially. And so I was wondering if it's like a very heated debate, and I'm not sure I understand it used in this context.
Yeah, so in order to understand why you have relativism here, you have to read the previous paragraph, 122, okay? It's not a way not to answer your question. So it's a way, I tell you what I believe, okay? It's a way for the Pope to put this argument inside an old ongoing debate within Catholicism, which is relativism versus strong moral ethics, strong ethical principles. So you have this kind of fight against relativism, saying, at least since the 19th century, all these modern ideas, they are just throwing the baby with the water, the bathwater. We should keep strong ethical principles, And so you have some conservative Catholics who would say that's actually the identity of Catholicism. And you have more, let's say, quote-unquote, progressive Catholics who would say, yeah, maybe, but we have to understand the situation, the singularity of this historical situation, etc., etc. For instance, you have this question with the pro-life versus non-pro-life debate, no? So Francis, and I think this is a rhetorical strategy, includes this argument, which is not directly related to the relativism, the controversy within Catholicism, inside the discussion about relativism. So, in other words, what he says is that, those people who are abusing children, who are abusing elderly, who are destroying the planet, they are relativistic. They don't hold ethical principles. So he phrases inside a quote-unquote conservative framework or rhetoric a very path-breaking, provocative thought, but he makes it acceptable because it's phrased with words which belong to the conservative side of the debate within Catholicism. You get that? Someone else might interpret this in a different way. And I'm not saying this is cynical on the side of the Pope, etc., etc. It's just a rhetorical trick. And I think it's true. I mean, those people who are abusing children and elderly and destroying the planet don't hold ethical principles, So they are truly, genuinely relativistic in a sense, okay? But of course, when I say that, I'm using the word relativism in a sense which is slightly different from the usual sense which is given to it by more conservative people. Does this make sense?
I think so.
Okay. Other questions about this? We stop. What's happening here?
You need to go to the other screen. That's all over there.
Okay. Okay, so we will start with this after the break. Let us start again. If you agree with that. So, the most difficult part is now. So please, the most difficult part is now. So listen carefully. So the last part of my talk is about institutions, which is an object which is barely studied by economists. Why? Because most of them would believe that the unique institution which matters is the market. That's not true. So there is a beautiful work by Elinor Ostrom, but many people have worked on this before her, but let's put her name as a way to fix ideas. She got the Nobel Award in 2009, so she provides a lot of legitimacy to this kind of work. And what she said essentially is that, oh, you economists, you see everything in black and white. So you believe that the world is made of two types of goods, private goods and public goods, and that's it. So black and white. And she said, no. There is a variety of other goods which are neither public nor private. So what is a private good according to the classical conventional definition that we are going to challenge in a few seconds? The classical definition is a private good is a good whose consumption is rival, in the sense that if I eat this pizza, even Valerio cannot eat it. You can imagine that? Valerio, so either Valerio or me. So the consumption is rival. And the access can be, I can be excluded from accessing to this pizza if I don't pay the price to buy this pizza. It's like a tax. So not everybody has access to this pizza, and for instance, replace the pizza by a big yacht. If you don't have enough money, you cannot just purchase this yacht, and that's it. So you are excluded. Okay? So that's a private good. A public good is exactly the opposite. You can think of the sun in Sicily, beautiful place. So if I go on a beach in Sicily and I just stay under the sun, I'm enjoying the sun, which is beautiful. This does not prevent Valerio from doing the same. And it's the consumption is not rival. And it's very hard to put, a policeman or even a member of the mafia every 10 meters to ask me to pay a tax if I go on the sun. So the access is very hard to be turned into something excludable. Okay? So public good is something which is non-rival and non-excludable. Okay? So what Elinor Ostrom said is that, there are two other types of goods, club goods and common goods. Commons. A club good is a good whose consumption is non-rival, but whose access is excludable. You can think of a chess club. If I enter into a chess club, in order to enter into this, I have to pay fees, probably, so it's excludable. But once I'm there, I don't prevent anybody from playing. Quite on the contrary, I'm a new partner for others. Okay, so consumption is not rival. And commons, it's exactly the opposite. The consumption is rival, but it's very hard to turn the access into something which is excludable. And the main example that everybody has in mind is a pond, let's say in Guinea, where people live from the fisheries. Consumption is rival, because if I go fishing during the night and I break all the trophic chains, next year there won't be any fish in the pond. And so I have killed the resource, so consumption is rival. But the access is very hard to be turned into something excludable, because you cannot put a policeman behind every tree around the pond to make sure that nobody is fishing during the night. Okay? So that's a commons. And then the big question is, what are the rules that human beings in real life, not in some fancy, crazy model conceived by a neoclassical economist, but in real life, what are the rules that people have implemented that have turned out to be successful in order to take care of commons? And so what she ended up with is a list of 8 criteria. I'm not going to enter into these criteria, but you will have the slides, or you can go on the Wikipedia site, a page dedicated to Elinor Ostrom, and you will have the 8 criteria. And you could ask yourself, take something you take care of, like the euro, for instance. We were talking about the euro. And ask yourself, is it true that the institutions which take care of the euro, like the Euro Commission, the European Parliament, the ECB, do they fulfill this criteria? Yeah? So there is one criterion, where is it? Number 6, which is definitely not fulfilled by European institutions, which is there should be a mechanism of conflict resolution that is cheap and easy to access to. Remember what happened between Greece and Germany during the Greek public debt crisis. Greece could no longer pay back its debt, and many people knew it from the beginning when Greece entered into the Eurozone in 2001. It was not a surprise, despite what many people said. And Germany wanted to force Greece to pay. And that's why there was an adjustment plan which was imposed to Athens and which destroyed essentially the Greek economy. And some Greeks said, but we have forgiven part of the public debt of Germany in the 50s. How come now you're killing us while we have been so kind enough to help you during the 50s? while you were responsible for World War II. No? And I do believe this is not a completely crazy objection. No? So anyway, there was no mechanism of conflict resolution between Greece and Germany. There is no such thing. And therefore, it's the law of the strongest, which is prevailing. No? So an example of a mechanism which works with criterion 6, which I witnessed when I was observing a project which was funded by the French Open Bank as a chief economist in Guinea-Conakry. That's why I was mentioning this. So it's a tribe of people who live near Zelikore. Zelikore is the dark forest, the deep forest of Guinea-Conakry, where you had the last Ebola crisis. That's why I visited this place. And it happens that there, people who live in the forest, they are far away from the coast, so they cannot go to the coast to fish. And they are in the forest, so they can't have cows or cattle in order to get proteins. So they have a lack of proteins. So how do they do? Well, they have fishes in ponds, essentially. So they rely on ponds. The question is, how do they organize themselves in order to protect this resource as a commons? And then, knowing the work by Elinor Ostrom, I asked the people who were presenting to me the project, and when you have a conflict, how do you do? You know? Rule number 6. So, of course, I didn't say rule number 6. No, I said, when you have a conflict, what do you do? And the guy said, oh, it's a very clever question. What we do is that we have agreed upon in advance that if we have a serious conflict, then we are all going to ask the question to a wise man, a wise old man, in a nearby village which is only 20 kilometers away from our village. The identity of the guy has been agreed upon in advance, and he agrees to play this role. So he's sufficiently far away so that he doesn't have any conflict of interest with us, but he's sufficiently close so that we know him, he knows us, and we trust him. And he will decide on our behalf to solve the conflict. So that's a very wise way to fulfill rule number 6, you see? And then when I came back to France, I thought, well, you know, these poor peasants in Guinea-Conakry, they are more clever than all the civil servants of the European Commission, who have just forgotten to have Rule 6 in the Eurozone, you see? Which means they have an institutional wisdom that we don't have. So, you know, it's a new type of wisdom. It's a wisdom which deals with institutions, how they really work in daily life with human beings, who have all the day conflicts of interest, etc., etc. You see what I mean? And I think that's what also economists should study. They should spend a lot of time studying these institutions to understand how they work. But of course, to do this, they have to talk to political scientists, they have to talk to sociologists, to anthropologists, which they usually don't, because they believe they know everything about everything. No? So this is just to open the door to a scientific dialogue between economists and those political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, who used to study institutions. And I think that's key if we want to solve our problems. Because, of course, you can imagine, my point is to say, you know, global health is a commons. Now we know it, thanks to the pandemic. What's happening to a family in Wuhan matters for me, for my life and my health. Okay? So there is an interdependency of all the human beings in terms of health. So you cannot privatize this. If you turn this into a private good, everybody's going to die. Why? Because, let's say, if you say, well, the access to the vaccine is costly, there will always be poor people who won't be able to afford the price of the vaccine, so you turn the vaccine into something which is excludable, okay? So the poor, quote unquote, will not be vaccinated, so they will get the virus. The virus will mutate, you have new variants. The variants will then infect the wealthy who are vaccinated, but for whom this vaccine doesn't work with the new variant. So they will have to conceive a new variant, a new vaccine, etc., etc. And then someday a super virus will come, for which we don't have any vaccine, and which will kill everybody. So that's a scenario, that's a fantasy scenario, but you understand. To privatize health is the best way to condemn everybody to death. See what I mean? Does it mean that we should turn health into a public good? I don't think so. Because fortunately, there is no such thing as a big global state which can take care of health as a public good. Fortunately. It's not a club good, but it's a commons. And then the question is, how do you build international institutions that will take care of health as a commons. You see? Because the World Health Organization has shown that it's completely inefficient. Nobody was listening to them. They don't have any real say on what's happening in countries, so it's no longer efficient. There are fantastic people working in WHO, I know them. There are fantastic scientists, fantastic physicians, etc., etc. Highly committed. They worked like crazy during the pandemic. But at the end of the day, the institution, not the people, the institution was completely inefficient, which means we need to have new institutions. Same story for the Security Council of the United Nations. They didn't say anything during the pandemic. They don't say anything about the war in Ukraine. So which means this institution, the Security Council of the United Nations, is no longer working. We need new institutions. Yeah.
Do we have to have new institutions, or can we also transform the existing?
So the question is, do we need new institutions, or can we transform old institutions? I don't know. Maybe we have to do both, you know. We may transform a certain number of institutions because we can transform them, and maybe there are a number of institutions we cannot transform because the conflict of interests are too high. You know, I don't know. It depends upon the nitty-gritty of the institution, how it works in real life, etc., etc. It's a good question. I'm not saying we have to reinvent everything from scratch. For instance, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, I believe is still a very interesting organization, which does not come from the Bretton Woods Agreement, but which comes from much earlier, the 1920s, okay? And probably I would rather reform ILO instead of trying to build a new ILO, definitely. The World Trade Organization, WTO, I'm not sure, maybe we should just close it, you know, and pay pension to the guy who is in charge of this. I don't, you know? No, I'm kidding, no. But you see what I mean? There is a discernment that we have to put into practice for each institution. Does this make sense? No? Of course, yeah. Valerio.
Another question. The problem of institutions is often that they are coming from it's a top-down approach. You know, the big player, they make institution and they rule the world. And the question is, it's possible to create institution from a bottom-up approach, you know, from out of civil society, which is not limited by national borders, kind of international civil society. You know?
Sure, it is.
A new social contract,
Yeah.
but in the bottom-up.
So my favorite example, I'm sorry for those who don't already know this example, is the NDI in Switzerland, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, which was presented, by the way, by Elena de Nictolis in the previous conference at the beginning of this week. So the NDI has been launched something like 17 or 18 years ago in Geneva by French physicians. It's a platform, international platform, which deals with neglected diseases. Diseases which are neglected by the private sector because those people who suffer from these diseases are too poor. That's the excludable problem. They are too poor to buy the classical therapy. Like hepatitis C, there are a number of people who suffer from hepatitis C in Africa, especially in Egypt, but they are too poor to buy the classical therapy that we have in Europe against hepatitis C because it costs something like 3,000 euros. And they don't have this money. So the NDI has organized a way for both the private sector, big pharma, a number of sovereign states, and a number of NGOs to collaborate with each other in order to find therapies against neglected diseases that they sell at a very cheap price. So they try to reduce the excludability problem. And they sell now therapies against hepatitis C in Egypt for $300, which is much more affordable. So DNDI is an example of a platform where they have conceived a governance at the international level, so they don't care about national boundaries, but they have sovereign states on board, as well as the private sector and NGOs who work together. So that's an example for me of a new hybrid institution, which is neither the market nor the state, nor just NGOs, but everybody. And instead of competing against each other, they collaborate with each other to find things and to do things which look like miracles. And I think that's a very good example. We could take inspiration from that and say, what about creating a DNDI at the world level in order to solve the big health problems that we are going to encounter in the coming decades? Not just the next pandemic, which will come anyway, but also, for instance, the bioresistance of our bodies. We are slowly becoming more and more resistant to medicine. This will create a huge problem if someday there is one disease which we cannot deal with traditional, classical, conventional medicine, if you're aware of this question. So that's an example. And so we are working on DNDi as, I believe, a very promising example of this kind of institutional wisdom that we have to learn. Yeah.
In the economy that we live in right now, there is a tendency to have the common goods become private goods.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
that's a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's done through privatization, and sometimes
Yeah, right.
it's done through outsourcing,
Yeah.
which is a depletion of rights.
Yeah. So there is a very good remark, which is today there is a tendency to turn most common goods into private goods. Insofar we privatize them. And I believe this is the consequence of the capitalization procedure. There are a number of people who want to turn everything into capital. And for that purpose, they turn this first into a private ownership commodity. They commodify it, and then they turn it into a capital by saying its value is the flow of its income. The unique way, from my viewpoint, to resist against that is to have a state which implements a law to protect the commons. In other words, I don't believe that the commons can flourish spontaneously. They will be destroyed either by the privatization process or the tribalization process, which is another enemy against the commons. And in order to prevent this from happening, we need a state. That's a new mission for the state. Usually, political philosophy doesn't think of the state in these terms, but I do believe that's the real mission of the state today, which is to protect the commons so that the civil society can invent institutions that we need to promote the commons. And without it, and this is a point where I disagree with a number of, let's say, quote-unquote, leftist activists who believe that we can build a society only on commons. I don't believe that. This is not true, unfortunately. That's why we need a state. Does this make sense? Yeah, a question over there?
Does the idea of institutions that are solving problems, is this an idea of a democracy idea? Does this also work in authoritarian systems?
Of what?
Like in authoritarian systems?
So that's a good question. My viewpoint, but some people may disagree with that, is to say that the commons, they encapsulate the idea of democracy. If the governance of the commons requires, if you go back to, where is it? Oh, yes, here. If you go back to this, it requires that everybody can, that's here, collective choice arrangements that allow most commoners to participate in the decision-making process, which means there must be some kind of participatory democracy. Does not mean necessarily the liberal democracy a la UK, okay, but some kind of participatory process so that everybody who is concerned by these commons can take part in the decision, collective decision. So I definitely agree with you. And you can view this from the other side, saying what's wrong in the democracy today, as we know it, which my viewpoint is that what we would call the public sphere, since, let's say, the 18th century, Enlightenment, and Immanuel Kant, who was advocating the public sphere as the place where we should have a collective discernment about what we want to do in a democratic space. This has been partially privatized. Look at who owns the media, and tribalized. Look at what Twitter is doing with people under the Trump era, for instance. So Twitter is turning the quote-unquote public sphere into a number of tribes of people who don't talk to each other, who hate each other, who fight each other, etc., and who live in completely different worlds, out of reality. So the intellectual challenge is to think of what Kant used to think of the public sphere as a common sphere. It's not a public sphere. It's not the state which has to decide who says what in this area. It should be a common sphere, but the state should protect it from being privatized or from being tribalized. You see? That's my viewpoint. Yeah, question over there?
And then there's your colleague, Thomas Piketty, who proposes to reduce private property quite substantially, right? I mean, to have this quarter of the private goods be much more controlled.
Yeah, sure. So he advocates that. Yeah, sure. So he doesn't speak about commons, but if we want commons to flourish, we need, of course, to put rules and boundaries to the privatization process, definitely. Yeah. Any other question? So, so I don't have time to. Yeah, maybe just very quickly. So this has something to do with my book. So I'm publishing a book in October, which is essentially the political philosophy of what I'm now describing. It's in French. It will be translated hopefully someday into English. You can buy it. So for the lazy people, there is the paperback version, 800 pages. For the others, there is the EPUB version, 1,000 pages. So I hope you will take the EPUB version. No, I'm kidding. So very quickly, once you have these four concepts, you may understand that actually there is no such thing as the idea that a resource or a good would be intrinsically private or public or common or tribal. It's a political decision to turn a resource into a private good or a public good. So the simplest example, I believe, is education. Education within the Roman Empire was a completely private good. It turned into a tribal good during the Middle Age, where aristocracy could organize things in such a way that the kids of the elderly would have access to education. And then the bourgeoisie, starting in the 16th century, mostly thanks to the Jesuits in Europe. And then in the 18th, late 19th century, education became a public good, where the state would say, that's my job to take care of education, the education of the kids. And for those who know this, you had this famous series, French-Italian series about Don Camillo, which is based on the rivalry between the teacher in the village and the priest, the pastor. And what are they struggling about? About the monopoly of the education in the village. The church saying essentially education is a tribal good and I'm in charge of it. The state saying no, education is a public good and the teacher is in charge of it. And I guess the main challenge today, both politically and from a pedagogical viewpoint, is to turn education into a commons. How do you organize education in such a way that it becomes a commons? But that's an example which shows you that across history, the same resource has changed. The status of education has changed. And nowadays, in a number of European countries, education is again privatized. In France, it's quite clear. One government after the other is destroying public education in order to promote private education. So maybe we don't think this way, but our society is slowly deciding that it's no longer interesting to have public education, it's much more interesting to have private education for the wealthy. You see? That's a collective decision. Yes, question?
But why should education become a common good?
Oh, that's my normative viewpoint. Yeah, because I don't see who could take care of the education if not the civil society in a democratic state. If it's the state, if it's a public good, you have a question which is what do people learn in Russia today, for instance, about what's happening in Ukraine? If it's completely privatized, it means the poor won't have access to education. Why isn't this a right for people, even if they are poor, to have access to education? If it's a tribal good, it means only Trumpists will have access to education in the US. The Trumpist tribe, or the Democratic tribe, the Biden tribe, So it must be common.
But where will be who are the rivals then?
The rivalry. Oh, you can, if I give a lecture here, a very simple example, we are thinking about organizing lectures in Georgetown University in the US in such a way that the same lecture could be provided both in Georgetown and in other Jesuit universities, let's say in Latin America or in Europe. And then the administration of Georgetown is saying, hey, but the kids who are following these lectures in Georgetown, they have to pay for that. So they don't necessarily agree that someone like you, who didn't pay the fees that they had to pay and for which they had to get a lot of debt, which will just, be a pain in the ass in their entire life after the studies. How come you would have access to this for free? See? So that's the privatization, actually, of education. You see? So there is a rivalry of education if you turn education into a private good. So you see, when you ask a question in the sense that, is education intrinsically a commons, in the sense that these criteria here would be fulfilled by education. But I think that's not the right question. It's not true that a resource is intrinsically a commons or intrinsically a private good or intrinsically a tribal good or a public good, you see. A resource is not intrinsically rival or not intrinsically excludable. It's very easy to find examples for that. Look at the swimming pool, So in France, most swimming pools are public swimming pools in the sense that they are taken care of by the state or by the municipality. Now, if you go swimming during the week at lunchtime, you will see you have to slalom among the people because there are too many people. So it's overcrowded. So it's a rival good, you see? It's not a public good in the sense that neoclassical economists would give to this word. Okay? But at the same time, you can exclude it. You can say to people you have to pay fees in order to enter the swimming pool. So you can turn it into a private good, but you can also say it's free of charge, why not? The taxpayer is paying for the swimming pool, so you can get rid of the excludable aspect. So a swimming pool is neither private, nor public, nor tribal, nor commons. It is what we decide it to be. You see? So same thing for education. So education is not intrinsically rival. We can turn it into a rival good if we decide to privatize education, and that's why we have this debate in Georgetown University. See what I mean? But we can also decide to turn education into a commons, in which case we don't have this debate. Does this make sense?
No, not really, because it still has to be rival if it's like common.
No. So let me explain this again. No, let me explain this again. This naturalist understanding is what most conventional economists would understand. So they would say in nature, there are common goods, there are private goods, there are public goods, and there are tribal goods. And you have to identify where this good fits, to have the right institution which takes care of that. Okay? Like you would say, well, there are males and there are females among human beings, and when you talk to a human being, you have to understand whether he belongs to the male category or she belongs to the female category. No? Now we are saying this gender separation is not natural, it's a convention. I'm saying exactly the same for that. I'm saying the separation between private goods, commons, tribal goods, and public goods is a convention, and we can change it. So education is not intrinsically private or public, etc. It is what we decide it to be. Does this make sense?
And this makes sense. And what is your idea? How should it be organized?
As a commons. And I don't have a solution. I don't know the institutions. What I know is that, for instance, to give you an example, what's happening in the Sustainability Institute in South Africa, Stellenbosch, where I used to go usually to teach, it's much closer to what I have in mind in terms of education as a commons. Much more participatory. We do things in commons. I mean, the students and the prof. For instance, we go gardening every morning in the botanic garden of the university together, the profs and the students, during half an hour, and we eat vegetables which are taken care of in the garden, and everybody's vegetarian. So this contributes to turning education into a commons. That is, we are teaching each other many things together. It's not just the prof, which in a completely top-down hierarchy provides information to the student. It's an experience that we share in common, that we make together, where we don't have the same position, I mean, I'm not identical to a student, but it's a completely different viewpoint from the classical viewpoint where the teacher tells everybody what he or she has to think, like the pastor in a church, It's very simple, just the way you organize the space in the classroom. Usually the space in the classroom is that there is a prof which is at one extremity, and he has lines of students who are listening to him or her, like in a train or like in a church. It's the same. So that's a completely public understanding of education. The state is speaking and telling you what you have to understand. The church is speaking and telling you what you have to know and to believe. God is speaking to you, and the unique thing you have to do is to listen and to obey. Whereas if you're organizing in a circle, okay, and the prof is one of the members of the circle, and we discuss, it's a completely different viewpoint. You may have the same in a church. You have churches now where the church itself is organized as a circle or an ellipsis. And if you are familiar with this kind of liturgy, it changes completely the liturgy. Why? Because it changes the way you understand what's going on. Same thing in a classroom. So that's a very simple example. You see what I mean? No, I don't know how to turn this into a commons 100% common, I don't know even if this has a meaning, But I'm sure we have to invent new types of pedagogy. So it seems to me, but I'm not an expert of that, what's happening today in Scandinavian countries, with new types of education, might be a way to go in this direction. But I know that's quite controversial, and I'm not an expert of that. Yeah, question there.
Returning back to the institutions, you was mentioning that you see institutions as being part of the solution and taking part. But I have a feeling that we are talking when the institutions are actually functioning, and now there are a lot of states where the institutions are actually not efficient or not completely insufficient in even fulfilling the function that they have at the moment, not even adding the additional. So how do you see it also in terms of this unequal distribution of the level of development of different institutions and also on the international level?
So what is the meaning of your question? I mean, I would answer by another question. What do you mean when you say that an institution is not efficient? It means you have set up a target and you make the judgment that according to this target, this institution is not efficient. Let me give you examples in Africa. There are many states in Africa which are completely inefficient in the sense we would give to the word an efficient state in Western countries, simply because people don't agree with the target that has been superimposed by colonial power in these countries, and they just don't want to have this. So they have been forced to mimic this Western state they don't agree with, and they try to, to manage and to survive in this completely crazy world. And an example, a very straightforward example is, in many sub-Saharan African countries, you have two types of law, the colonial law, the Western law, plus the traditional law, which is organized by the society. And when you have a conflict over the land, a piece of land, like nomadic people who try to steal a piece of land, and the peasants who try to resist against that, that's an old conflict, then they have two places where they can try to solve the conflict. One which is the Western colonial law, the other one which is the traditional law. And of course they play with both, depending upon where they believe they will have more success. And of course if you come as a Westerner and you say, how is the court working? Oh, it's completely inefficient, It's not working the way it should work like in a Western country. It's just you haven't understood at all what's going on. See? It's just that people are trying to play with different sources of law because, they were not the source of the European law, and these have been superimposed to them. And then if you ask how the European law in Africa works, you will of course end up with the conclusion it's inefficient. What does this exactly mean? I don't know, you see. Now, having said that, of course there are institutions which are completely inefficient according to the target that they have given to themselves. WTO is completely inefficient. I'll just give you an example. WTO doesn't have a say on the financial markets. Now, most commodities are financialized, which means that the price of these commodities, be it wheat, oil, coal, whatever, is not driven by the equality of supply and demand on the spot market for these commodities, but is driven by financial markets with financial derivatives on this commodity. So if traders in Wall Street decide to bet that the price of oil is going to increase, the price of oil is going to increase because of non-arbitrage relationships between the price of derivatives and the spot price of oil. And this has nothing to do with oil. It has everything to do with expectations of a bunch of people in Wall Street and in the city. Now, of course, you could say, well, that's a big concern for WTO. But I talked with the president of WTO when he was a French, Pascal Lamy, and he said, I cannot do anything. Because according to the constitution of WTO, I have no say on financial markets. So he's just missing 90% today of the problem. So WTO has become a completely irrelevant institution. Now you could say, and this goes back to the question you raised, you could try to reform WTO by saying, well, we should include financial markets in the perimeter of the legitimacy of WTO, which would be certainly a big revolution. Or you might just say, WTO is completely irrelevant, let's do something else. I don't know, I have no solution for everything. See what I mean? Can I go further? Yeah, last question.
I was
wondering whether power inequality dynamics actually plays along this table. For example, I'm giving an example of the COVID-19, the vaccines which were distributed. And I'm from Africa, and I know that governments in Africa were actually, at some point, the vaccine was a private good, whereby the governments were saying it's too expensive for us, we cannot buy for our people. And so I'm just wondering whether the power dynamics inequalities play in all this.
Of course, it plays a big role. Once you enter into the question of how do we treat health or biodiversity or climate or the oceans as commons, private goods, etc., of course there is a big power struggle beneath the surface. One example, one very easy example today is there is an ongoing discussion within the United Nations about the status of the deep oceans. Now we have the technique to dig into the deep oceans. And part of these deep oceans does not belong to anybody, not even to states. So there is this question today, which status, which legal status do we give to deep oceans? And there are a number of lawyers who argue we should give them the status of global commons. That is, no state is the owner of this, no private company is the owner of this. And of course, you have private companies which enter into the debate and say, no, why? I would like to privatize this as this part of the Pacific Ocean because there are plenty of resources I need in the bottom of this ocean. And then you have states like the French state who in front of the camera claims to defend the oceans as a commons, but who beyond the scene are protecting and defending the private sector. So you have a number of complex strategies and a lot of power struggle which is shaping the kind of answer we give to this. Sure, definitely. Other question? So we still have 10 minutes. Am I right? No?
Yes, but then at 12:15 we will have lunch already. So.
Yeah, so 5 minutes. So very quickly, and you will have time to study as homework the slides. What I wanted to say after that is that, I will skip this. Sorry. There are a number of structures on which I believe economists should reflect. Family structures. It's not true that there is a single structure of family in the world which has always been the same and which will always be the same. That's not true. So there is a French anthropologist who studied and demograph who studied this, and he ended up with at least 5 different types of families. I don't have time to enter into the details. And you can have maps of these families. So you see there are different structures of family, even in Europe, and even at the world level. So, and it happens that he argues that there is a relationship between the kind of family structure which is prevailing in a place and the kind of political structure you can build. The main argument being that, well, you have a number of places like here where you have a very, quote-unquote, authoritarian structure of family. And then he says, no wonder whether these countries are at ease with very authoritarian political regimes. While, for instance, in the UK and a bit less in the US, and also in the US, you have a very atomized family structure where the kids leave the family very early and they inherit the heritage in a very unfair way, unequal way. So unfairness is part of life for these people because they experience it as a kid in a family. They know from the beginning that, well, my brother will earn everything and I will have nothing. That's life. So they are at ease with market-based solutions which are deeply unfair. By contrast, you have places like here in Europe. Let me show you this. Oh, yeah, okay. Here, where the blue areas here, where you have egalitarian atomic families, where all the kids get approximately the same in terms of inheritance, okay, and they leave their parents very early. So it's not an authoritarian family. The parents don't have a say about the life of the kids as adults, and at the same time, all the kids inherit more or less the same thing, the same quantity. So they are used to have an egalitarian viewpoint about life, and they are not at ease with unfair solutions. Then he argues that it's not a wonder whether the French Revolution took place here, because it's blue, So here, for instance, in Italy, that's very interesting. If you look at the map of the Communist Party, so the map of the Communist Party almost coincides with the red area here in Italy. Why, he argues? Well, because these Italians were used to very authoritarian families, where la nonna, as you know, is omnipotent. No? So you may discuss this, you may challenge this viewpoint, but I do believe that we definitely need to understand how family structures shape our vision and shape our social relationships. The interesting thing also is that they change across time. For instance, in China, I don't know whether we see it here. No, we don't see it. The map is not precise enough. In China, you have atomic structures on the periphery here around China. His argument is to say, well, originally, Chinese people were implementing the atomic structure. But then, when they sedentarized for agriculture, something like 13,000 years ago, they needed people to stay on the piece of land that they were cultivating. So slowly, the family structure changed into a family structure where the kids have to stay with their parents, which gives much more power to the parents. Why? Because they have to take care of the land. So the natural ecosystems where people are embedded in shape the family structure. Of course, it takes a long time, but it happens. And so that's why he argues, like in linguistic areas where you see languages which are put to the periphery, because they are just, pushed away by the new language, the family structure, the old family structure, the atomic family structure has been pushed to the periphery by the new one, which is much more authoritarian. You see? So you have a history of family structure, which is deeply linked to natural ecosystems. And in turn, family structures have an influence on political regimes. Okay? So, and I will stop here very, very briefly. Let me show you this. Yeah. The full picture is here. Sorry. So you have family structures which change over centuries. You have moral principles in economic relations. I don't have time to describe this, which change every day. You have the schemes that I was leading to: private goods, common goods, tribal goods, and public goods. You have also cosmologies in the sense of the scholar. All these systems interact with each other. They build a huge, complex system which is evolving across time at different speeds. So cosmologies evolve very, very slowly. Europe has changed its cosmology from an analogist cosmology to a naturalist cosmology in the 17th century, but there was one change within 2 millennia, 2,000 years. We change every day our moral principles. Types of capitalism, I don't have time to describe this, change every 35, 50 years. Political schemes change every 10 years, So it's a very complicated systems, where you have different parts which influence each other and change at different speeds, And I do believe if we want to understand, if we want to have a theory of change, in order to really address the ecological challenge, we need to understand that. Because the ecological challenge is such a deep civilizational challenge that we will have to change this. This will be completely reshaped. In 50 years, it will be completely different from what we see today. But we need to understand how. How are they going to interact with each other? How are they going to change? Obviously, the family structure is collapsing today in many places, including Europe. What is the family structure in 20 years? It will change, for sure. Maybe a new type of family structure will arise. I have no idea. But if we don't think this, we are going to lose and to miss part of the story. And obviously, natural ecosystems are at the center. So I already described the way natural ecosystems have influenced and shaped family structures in China. But obviously, ecosystems have a say on our cosmology, the way we understand our relationships to the cosmos, obviously. But they also have an influence on the schemes that we put into practice. If you're a tribe in Guinea-Conakry and you survive only because you have fisheries and ponds, you may try to organize them as commons much more easily than if you are, let's say, in California, in the US. So natural ecosystems definitely have a say on the kind of schemes that we are choosing. And of course, vice versa, the schemes that we're using have an impact on ecosystems. Privatization obviously destroys ecosystems, a number of ecosystems. You see? So, in a nutshell, that I want to end it with, just to say, I summarize everything. Money creation is key, and it's a mystery which needs to be unveiled for the survival of our democracy, I believe. Matter, energy, ecosystems, biomass, water are key for our survival as well. And unfortunately, they are mostly neglected by most economists. And then institutions. And we need to have a democratic discussion about the kind of institutions that we want to build to take care of the global commons that we want to have access to in the coming decades, despite the ecological challenge. And I will stop here. Thank you.